Welcome back to TED Talk 1 on regeneration. I'm John Comber. I'm the former Chief Exec of Greenwich Council, and I have with me 3 members of a panel and 1 member virtually, who I'll introduce now. First is Jonathan Hewish, Chief Exec at Capital People. Next is Amanda Milliner, Chief Operating Officer at Capital People. David Tutt, who introduced the conference, leader of Eastbourne Council, and virtually Chris Knott, Senior Partner, Capital Law. We're here to discuss regeneration, and as Andrew Lana has said, this is the beginning of a conversation which is intended to turn into networks of people who share common interests and challenges through the Alchemy platform, which has been advertised and again will be brought to you to offer you the opportunity to engage. Regeneration is a very large subject, so I'm just going to put it in some fairly simple boxes. We've got physical regeneration, economic regeneration and social regeneration, and some would now say virtual regeneration with the advent of social media and property platforms where presence, identity, brand and reputation can be all important to the digital identity of an area, which can indeed influence property prices and how much people want to move into an area or businesses invest in an area. The words change over time, so physical, economic, social can be replaced with people, planet and prosperity, but it's the same type of thing. It's about how do you make the most of your opportunities, and where things are broke, how do you make interventions that are going to work. That's all as an introduction. You can ask questions online. We'll be able to see those and I will refer to them as we go through. But I'm going to ask each of the panel members to get involved in the discussion because of the rich depth of experience they have. And I'm going to start with Chris Knott and ask him to talk a little about his work on the future of regeneration. So Chris, perhaps you'd like to start us.
John, thanks for the opportunity. I think the reason I'm here is not because I'm a lawyer, but because for the last 10 years or so, I've worked as a member of the private sector with the Welsh Government on its economic regeneration strategy. And if I may, I'll talk in structures and then in substance very briefly. The Welsh Government is, in Wales, we have this interesting, we have devolution. So we have a layer of government above the local authorities. I say above the local authorities, but with the local authorities. They have a track record, I say, for the last decade in trying to involve the private sector in its decision making. And they've become quite experienced in the method by which that works. It's a difficult thing to do properly. You've got to get the right people, give them the right mandate, and give the right levels of accountability. And at the moment, the Economy and Transport Department, a thing called the Ministerial Advisory Board, which I'm vice chairman, which is 10 people who try and assess government policy from government regeneration economic policy with the private sector eye. When the COVID pandemic hit and we went into crisis mode, what I was asked to do was to create a sort of group aside from that, involving some of the members of the Ministerial Advisory Board, but very senior members from across Wales, very senior people in the private sector across Wales, such as the Chairman of Transport for Wales, Chairman of our airport, Chairman of our Development Bank, Head of IOD, CBI and the like, to give very rapid, quick advice to the government economically about the sort of regeneration policies that it should put in place. And that group reported to government, which went to the cabinet, and our cabinet decided on a four-pronged strategy for regeneration from now on, which was people, place, digital, and decarbonisation. That's based on economic regeneration. Aside from that, because I saw you talk about social, economic, and virtual regeneration, there's a separate group in Welsh Government led by the Council General that are looking at the whole regeneration much more holistically. But my focus is on economic regeneration. And what was interesting, firstly, was the unanimity that there was in the private sector about the regeneration strategy that the government should adopt. I was expecting divergence of opinion, but the unanimity was around that you can only do this effectively if you have a vision. To put it into practicalities, there is a declining pot of financial resource that one has available to deal with this. It's much smaller than the demands on it. So how does one prioritise where one goes? And the views that seem to be getting traction in Wales is around a vision for a future based on well-being. That GVA is but one measure of well-being. It's not a GVA-led recovery, it's a well-being-led regeneration. And that the Welsh Government has basically four principal levers of economic levers. It has influence and can build confidence, it can build infrastructure, it can provide financial support, and it can develop skills. And just to summarise very quickly, the advice which is going in, which seems to be accepted in this regard, is that as to infrastructure, the focus is on digital and on affordable housing. And that when it comes to finance, I will not put smug face on, but have an advantage on the rest of the United Kingdom in that we have our own National Development Bank, which has worked very effectively for the last 3 or 4 years, and which is a natural vehicle for the funneling of government funding, government-led funding, whether it's match funding or not, out into the economy. And of course, as far as developing skills is concerned, regenerating FE and HE to suit all of the above, so to suit a decarbonised, digital, green, well-being type economy.
Thanks, Chris. David, if I turn to you, in terms of Eastbourne's recovery plan, how does that sit with the priorities that Chris has just outlined? Are those in the recovery plan?
I believe they are, although we use slightly different terminology. I mean, we've done a lot in terms of regeneration as a town before the COVID pandemic, but that sent us this curveball that threw all the plans out of kilter. And we set up, as most councils did, a local COVID group, which I chair, met weekly initially. More recently, as the number of infections, rate of infections reduced, we moved it out to fortnightly, we moved back to weekly, who knows, before long. But that involved all partners, so political parties put their differences aside and concentrated on what needed to be done. The police, the other statutory agencies, but more importantly, the business sector and the voluntary sector involved in that. And we put together a recovery plan, which is led by my deputy, who also happens to be the chief executive of the local bid. So we had business in there from the word go. And they put together a plan that started off looking at how you survive, then how we revive, and then eventually moving on to how we thrive. So that's the terminology that we used, John. And when I talk about how we survive, it was about ensuring that businesses had the understanding of what grants were available to them. So the council obviously played a role in that and got those grants out of the door as quickly as was possible so that they had money in the bank to keep them through the lockdown, the first lockdown. But also advice from groups such as Local Enterprise Agency on the furloughing, on retraining some people and giving them new skill sets. Then we moved into the Revive, and Revive used the expertise and the knowledge of our business partners. So we've got, in addition to the Chamber of Commerce, we've got a group called the Hospitality Association. These are hoteliers and restaurateurs. And they used, the very first step, they used their supply chain to ensure that we had access to food to help our community and the vulnerable within our community. They used their supply chain again to ensure that we had PPE for all of our businesses. And so we didn't have the challenges that some faced in finding it difficult to get hold of those vital supplies. Then that group put together a local quality mark. And so if you go around the shops and the businesses in Eastbourne, you'll see that quality mark in the windows. And that tells people that in the same way as we have here, a hand sanitizer and everything else, that those businesses are doing everything that they should be doing in order to ensure against the transmission of the virus. So that was very good. And the third part of the second stage, so survive, revive. So the second stage of the revive was setting up an online shopping facility. So local independent traders go on to something called EB1, and one EBN, and there you see local shops, and those shops deliver. So you can order online, you can pay with your credit or debit card just once, so you can shop at different shops, and those goods arrive at your house the following morning. So that helped to keep our traders working, kept them in business, and also we linked a similar operation via the council's website. So that was the how do we managed to revive. Moving into the Thrive, there's a lot of activity. The council owns certain property within Eastbourne. We're looking at creating a food street. We're looking at how we can base our marketing on our environmental credentials. So we've set the target of being carbon neutral by 2030. And we're working again with our community in order to achieve that. And so it's about what we do to market the town post-pandemic and bring visitors back to the lovely area that is Eastbourne.
Fantastic.
I think one of the things that I've seen happen most strongly during the last period during COVID is the way in which not just local authorities but other parts of the public and private sector and third sector have come together to build partnerships really quickly to deliver on the ground in a way that I've not seen probably in 20 years in local government of my time doing that. That becomes hugely important moving forwards. As I think Chris was saying earlier, there's obviously going to be less funding in the system now. We need communities to be more resilient. One of the challenges that we have is now maintaining that level of partnership moving forward. I think we've entered into them swiftly. They've built bonds really quickly. Maintaining those into the long term becomes important. But actually there's part that I'm sure Amanda might join in around, which is around that community co-production of this future direction of travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really important that we involve communities in the future. It's a long process. Engaging communities can be a very difficult, long process. Building trust with them can be difficult. And we talk about an intelligent customer. So if I can refer to a local estate near where I live in the Swansea, the South Wales Valley, just social housing on top of a beautiful mountain. Everybody who lives there has lived there all their lives probably, love living there. There is a need to redevelop that particular community. And when you try and engage the community, it's sometimes difficult to get them to see what it could look like. So it's a bit like talking to them 20 years ago about what a smartphone would look like when they're still using their phone with the cord. How do you get them to see what it could look like? So, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, for sure.
When we're talking about regeneration and recovery, is there any difference? Has regeneration always been about recovery, or is the pandemic putting a spin on it which is somewhat different to how it stood before?
To me, I remember the phrase, never waste a good crisis. I think there is a difference between the two, but what the pandemic has done is it's kind of busted everything so that you have to fix it quickly. You have to fix it now. And whereas in the past, if you take, for example, remote working, I know that's not what we're talking about, but it's a very good illustration, which is that it's completely busted the myth that working at home is skiving. And therefore, it facilitates that generation of that economic activity very quickly. And now we're all moving on to the second generation of it. And I think it's the same with other elements of recovery and regeneration. Whereas we might have to go on a slow journey, bringing people with us, it's gone bang. You're okay, fine. Well, we've now got to fix that. But what I think is interesting in both the comment that John and Amanda made, and I agree with both of them, is there's a need to move swiftly. I mean, in certain regards, move really quickly without having things done to people. There's a real need to bring people with us. I say with us, to involve people in discussions, and when there are challenges with consulting, overcome those challenges and have people feel that they own the future and not have it done to them. And how you do that and move quickly at the same time is, I think, a challenge I'm not sure people have worked through yet.
And perhaps that plays to social regeneration. Many would say that the continuum of regeneration is physical begets economic, economic begets social, re-termed inclusive growth to stay away from social regeneration as a term. How do you do social regeneration? How do you involve people from the very beginning in helping themselves and working with their local council to get a better state of well-being? What's the best way of doing it? What are the tools?
So it's sorry, I think my mic's not working. It's about spending time, getting to know the communities. In my experience, I've always wanted to understand the demographic of the community I want to engage. So it's about connecting with local organisations and partners to understand that demographic and understand how best to reach out to them and how best to gather your data, gather your information and do your research and work with them. And like Chris said, it's not right to be doing things to a community. It's much better to co-produce the future with them so that they take ownership of it and you're understanding their needs. How can I decide what a community needs? I have to understand their needs. And it's also a little bit about managing those expectations and perhaps showing them other communities similar to theirs and what the results were for them. So it can be a long process, and I'm not really sure how we can move swiftly to achieve that in the current climate, because it does take time to build that level of trust and to really understand what the community is looking for and what it needs. And
David, what's the role of members in all of this?
Well, it starts, I think, with listening, John, rather than saying this is what you should be doing. It's listening to your community and picking up on the issues that are important to them. And the Eastbourne community has told us, I come back to our carbon neutrality objective, that they see beyond the pandemic, and they realise that the really big challenge for us all, whether in local government, national government, or just part of a community, is how we find sustainability. And that's brought together a really strong group of people who bring in all of the different lobby groups. So we've got Extinction Rebellion, we've got Friends of the Earth, we've got Greenpeace working with the Chamber of Commerce, the Hospitality Association, the Umbrella Group for the voluntary sector, and the statutory organisations, agreeing a set of objectives, but also agreeing plans as how you will achieve those objectives, who's taking the responsibility on each target, and putting timelines around that in a project sense. So it is working with the community, listening to them, and making sure that local governments are part of that, not the part that says this is what we need to do, but part of actually rolling your sleeves up and doing the work.
Thank you. We've got some questions coming in, so I thank those virtual delegates. The first question is, are there critical behaviours that are necessary to encourage the regeneration of local public services?
Wow. So I think there probably are a set of behaviours that are really critical, and lots of them are now about looking outwardly rather than inwardly. Lots of them are now much more about collaboration. Something that we've talked about in the past has always been a skill set around emotional intelligence. So being able to adapt our behaviours to those of others, and to be able to, there's a lot around nudge economics around at the moment and behavioural economics. So that thing about how you frame discussions to get the best out of both sides, to enable people to make stronger decisions in that space. And I think that's going to be really important. Following on from what David was saying earlier, that space, taking decarb as an example, that space where in the past a housing association might look at their houses to think about how they decarbonise those. Local authorities have particular strands that they work on. I was heartened a short while ago. We hosted a collaboration session where we had local government, housing and health in the same space. And for the first time that I can remember, once again, we started to build a shared approach to understanding how we tackle decarb between us. That space where that dialogue happens, creating that environment is becoming more and more important all the time, I think.
We've got another question. What is the importance of placemaking in the context of local regeneration? And we hear a lot about placemaking in terms of regeneration.
if I could come in on, so I think it's, now is the moment, is my personal view and the view of everyone I'm hearing. When we look at it in a Welsh context, we've got an unbalanced economy with a lot of strength down in the southeast and a lot of strength in the northeast, and everybody sees this as an opportunity to regenerate the beautiful market towns and of mid-Wales, the market towns across Wales. Because the need no longer to be based within a day's commute of your office means you can, many people, not everybody, but many people have the privilege now of being able to work wherever they want. But what's critical for that is digital infrastructure. And as we all know, that's a massive subject. That's just not about pipes in the ground. That's about software, it's about learning, it's about social inclusion, because there are many people who don't have access to that equipment. How do they get equipment? How do they get trained on it? How do they become accustomed to it? But to me, placemaking is the opportunity of the moment.
And I think there's another part to that as well. So there's a major town near where I live, and it's had a bad year. So before COVID, actually, there were a set of storms, caused flooding, huge amount of damage to that space. What we've now got, though, the regeneration programme for the council rightly had been about creating a number of iconic buildings in that space. And just before COVID hit, they created 3 new buildings with 1,100 office spaces as a driver to regenerate the town. Obviously now, given the shift to home working, there's a big question about what happens in that town centre. So how do we balance that shift out of the town centre into market towns and other places, at the same time maintaining some form of regeneration in that kind of town centre, where there's now likely to be 1,100 new office spaces post-COVID without 1,100 people to work in them. So we need to be clear about how we maintain that balance across all of activities and all regeneration.
And is there something in that about how we design property so that it can be flexibly used? And is there an issue about historic property? Is heritage a problem, or is it a benefit, and is it something that you can sell?
It can be a challenge, but I wouldn't say it's a problem. So a site that we've purchased recently has got an old Victorian water tower, and it had been owned by a housing association who were going to build houses, and they didn't. So we bought the land from them. We're going to develop houses around there. We're going to take the water tower and we're going to turn that into a mixed use. So we're going to have easy in, easy out business use there with penthouses above. And so it is about looking at how you use space. Another example on place setting, on the main thoroughfare between our railway station and the seafront, at the top end by the seafront, there were a row of shops with flats above, which had become rather run down. The company that owned them hadn't been maintaining them properly. They went into administration. We've purchased the whole of that block. We're revamping the shops. We're revamping and re-roofing the flats. Despite the pandemic, we've got a considerable amount of interest in taking on those units. And we're looking to turn that section of the road into what we're calling Food Street. It already had a number of restaurants, and we've got a lot of food-based businesses that want to be in that space because they can see the opportunities going forward.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question we've got in, the importance of transport infrastructure to local regeneration. Has it changed in the light of the pandemic? People no longer having to travel, is that a permanent change? Has that changed the dynamics of transport and transport nodes to the success of place?
I think it's a red hot subject here as I sit in Cardiff, because 12 months ago our government created a joint venture with Keolis Amy to devolve the train system, a part of the train system to them. To the Welsh people listening, I'm massively paraphrasing, but devolve part of the train system to them, and to invest in a metro to connect the railway network across the whole of South East Wales, which was the regeneration project of our time, which would lead to 30-odd railway stations, new ones, and the opportunity to revive the communities within half a mile of those stations and wider. And of course, that's completely thrown up in the air as everyone views driving in a car to be a safer thing to do. talking to the people close to that and the personal view, I think this is a short-term phenomenon. I think the decarbonisation agenda will win out, and the importance of public transport will come back. I don't think there's a long-term change there, but that's just a personal view. That's not a no.
Thank you.
What's clear from people I'm talking to is it's not going to be what it was, and it's probably not going to be what it is now. And organisations are trying to figure out what the future ways of working will be. So there might well be an impact on these new networks or transport networks.
Yeah, I think one of the things about the metro system in Wales, so it's been part of the city deal. It's been hugely funded through that. And I know a large part of it was about connecting people from the Valleys area and more broadly into Cardiff. Actually, what's now going to be clear is that there's likely to be, instead of just people heading into Cardiff in that kind of route, much more focus on some of the building community hubs in some of the towns outside of that, so that people don't have to come through that route so strongly. I think the interesting bit's going to be what happens to the road network and how much investment goes into maintaining and building that in the future. And I know we've had a huge debate in Wales as well about an M4 relief road and whether or not that's going to be built and go ahead, and it was stopped a while ago. But how do we continue that? How do we continue that investment in public transport, as Chris was saying? The balance is going to be important again.
And interestingly, we've had a challenge with the language we're using being service provision led as opposed to community development. And I think whilst we're going to go on in the next TED Talk to deal with community enablement, we should address that. How do we get community development at the heart of what we do in local government, and how do we make it so that it works and is just part of every day? And David, perhaps that's a...
It is, I think, through a network of local forums, and they're mixed. Some are residents within geographical areas, some are people with particular interest that want to set the future of the town. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about not trying to drive the agenda, but to listen, and then to be part of that agenda going forward, and making sure that your community are working hand in hand with you. So you're doing things that they want, because that's what we're all here for.
Thank you. And when we're talking about virtual regeneration, digital identity, interestingly, in terms of community development, social media is now working. How much does that influence and sway you in your day-to-day lives? How much does the public interaction now happen through social media as opposed to door knocking, other forms?
Gosh, I think the challenge probably for anybody who's a politician, local politician, is trying just to maintain and keep up with the number of different access channels that there are to you. I mean, everybody's got my home phone number and my mobile phone number, but then there's the Twitter account, there's Facebook, there's email, there's the council phone lines, there's Instagram. It's endless, and trying to keep up with everything that's being sent to you. And people, because they put something on Facebook, expect an answer. I contacted you. So it's a real challenge for us in local government to understand just exactly the different ways that people want to contact us. And does it influence us? To an extent, but what I always think with some of those groups, like the Facebook groups, is that you tend to get very strong views from a very small number of people, and you've got to balance that with the wider interest of the entire community.
And does that play into what you were saying earlier, Amanda, about smartphone analogy? How do people engage in such conversations from where they sit and what they know?
Gosh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I
think it's fascinating how quickly positions in communities form these days. Sometimes informed positions, sometimes not so informed. But actually, when you start balancing that out with the community leadership role that members have, actually that can be quite a challenge. How do you lead when positions are running away from you and building and forming in a social media perspective before you even get to influence that? And how then do you build that into your decision-making process in a council? The balance between those two things is really important as well, I think.
And that chimes with a question that's just come in, talking about the speed in relation to local regeneration, and Amanda mentioning how engaging with the community takes time. How do you make it work? Is it digital technology that bridges the gap? And it does seem that must be some of the answer.
I'm not sure. I don't think, for me, nothing quite replaces speaking to people. Digital communication can be very difficult in my experience. Nothing quite matches sitting face to face with somebody and having a true conversation.
But there's also there's a huge thing as well about that thing about opinion forming in a social setting. It can also be a factor for good in regeneration. So that town I was talking about earlier, one of the things that became clear was that it's got a cultural and artistic following that's been built up. And it's been built up more through social media than actual activity on the ground. And it's now being seen as an artistic hub of the future. And that's not because the council has necessarily driven that agenda or members, or it's because people have connected in the virtual world and have come together as like-minded people with like interests. And that's now forming part of the identity moving forwards of that town. So it's fascinating how that social space, that social media space, is driving regeneration in a different way.
And Chris, as you've said, we're in a situation now where home working has become a reality. People don't think it's skiving. That does mean technology is being used more extensively. Has that let the genie out the bottle? Does that involve more people? And does it mean we will see technology differently? It will just be part of the normal day, not part of some different process?
I'm going to... with no apologies, agree with everybody, because I think all the points that have been made I genuinely agree with. I think the big you've just hit, John, you just hit on the point, which is that the one thing that that COVID has given us is the ability to connect a very, very large number of people at a very short notice on one screen. You will know, creating a conference, for example, takes 6 months and people go to travel and go to hotels and the like. Whereas, for example, when I was doing this recent urgent piece of work for the Welsh Government, I could put together 20 leading people for 2-3 hours to have a really heated and well-informed discussion at 2 days' notice. And so that, I think, is increasingly important tool in this debate and in this communication. But I could not agree more with Amanda that we must not forget the people who do not have access to this, who do not only don't have access to this, but don't feel comfortable using digital technology. I work as an advisor to a community group who are significant asset owners as well, I reduced significantly the average age of this group, and they have refused to get together during the entire pandemic to make important decisions because none of them feel comfortable using this methodology that I'm using now and that we're all very, very comfortable with. I think Amanda's point that it has to be face-to-face methodologies to make sure that we really get proper engagement with people.
And we've been asked a question about the role of planning professionals in the context of holistic local regeneration and the hot potato about what the government's doing in relation to planning and whether it's taking more of the powers out of the hands of local authorities into other decision-making frameworks. What do we think about the role of the sometimes much maligned planning professionals? Are they doing a good job? Are they close enough to the public? Are they well thought of by members and communities?
For me, I think Chris, I think they've got a very important role to play, but I believe it's important that as they set out a vision of the options going forward, they remain open-minded and they listen to what the community is saying that they want in a place rather than trying to establish something that's cast in tablets of stone.
Chris?
I mean, as one gets older, you see within a few months a new government arriving, they have to shake up the planning system because it's got to move quicker. And then the moment a controversial decision comes in and the planning authorities try and stop it because it's impeding, it's helping some people, but impeding other people's lives. Everyone says, thank goodness for that. And my own view is I think they do a terrific job. They're in their communities. Do they get everything right? No. But goodness me, we're blessed to have them, a good one.
But I suppose for me, there's this perspective about it's not just planning decisions, but it's involving the public in planning policy in a dynamic way so that the public understand what the policy is, what the options are for their decision making, and therefore can be comfortable with the outcomes and hold their members to account for those outcomes, which is sometimes a different way of working. But I think we're all agreeing they need to do a good job, and they are doing a good job. And they are sometimes much maligned, as you say, for speed of decision making. Sometimes it's hard to make particularly controversial decisions. We've had another question about an interest in the position of members as leaders. What sort of leadership is being demanded from members? Is it no longer community leader, but more a facilitator on a journey? Ooh.
It's a really interesting question, and I think that there's a lot of truth in that final bit. It is a facilitator. I've never been somebody who claims original thought, but what I do think I've got an ability to do is pick up on good ideas and turn them into reality, and I think that's the role of a leader today. Understanding what the community want, picking up on those ideas and delivering.
Yeah, and I think leadership comes from many points in communities these days, doesn't it? So it's not just the councillor. The councillor does have that democratic legitimacy, but actually there's others. There's people who lead community and residents associations. There are people from school, from all walks of life, and everybody brings different skill sets, different strengths. And one of the abilities, I think, of local councillors is very much being able to knit those strengths together in a community, to be able to build things that wouldn't necessarily otherwise be there, and build that sustainability into that community in a different way as well.
And how do you lead and get collective leadership? Because often we hear about leaders, often we hear about mayors, often we hear about cabinets. How can that work effectively to represent all views? And is democracy inherently difficult to operate?
Was there ever a time when it wasn't?
Good answer.
I mean, seriously, yeah. I mean, I think that, well, the way that I do it is to invest an awful lot of time and spend time listening and talking to people and trying to draw thoughts together from different angles to come up with a solution that is acceptable to the majority.
And that diversity in perspective becomes hugely important then as well. So it's that notion that not just one person has the solution, or not just one person has the right answer. Actually, the answer is collectively found more often than not. And once again, that space for the local member to help facilitate that is really important.
I do love David's description of the leader, of facilitating. And if I may throw a slightly different perspective in on that, which is that one of the things that elected members and officials have to do is work one another out and navigate one another and work out how you get stuff done, because they've got different roles and responsibilities. And successful leaders and successful members, they can't get anywhere unless they work that one out. But go back to what John said earlier on, the challenges of maintaining partnerships. Everyone agrees that there's a need to consult with communities, consult with the private sector, work with the private sector. But actually, I don't think that the private sector, which is my particular experience, knows how to work with government, local, so often, because so often the private sector, it's what you need to do is as follows, and often it's not that. And there's a difference between having that view and being able to work with members and with elected officials and working with the officials to support them and get stuff done. So I feel in the facilitation process, there's a role for more work on helping communities and helping the private sector understand how you influence and make things happen.
Well, to talk about a relatively controversial subject, if we talked about housing and housing need, it's a difficult area when you're talking to communities. There's a supply issue, there's a construction issue. What is the best way to deal with housing as a regeneration priority?
That's a really good question. oh gosh, I've witnessed how perhaps not to do it. Lots. So for me, it's about managing expectation. So as a housing association, you'll have a budget. You can't, I've seen engagement with communities where they're asking for water slides down the mountain. It's, you know, you can't deliver that. It's managing those expectations for me. John, you're in housing. Yeah. What's your view?
So there's always a balance, isn't there? There's the housing need, showing the requirement for far greater houses of all types, both affordable and normal development, normal estate development. There's the community issue of actually we want it, but we don't want it here. There's the regeneration issue in terms of the spend, the jobs created in just developing that kind of approach. There's the question now about new technology to do that. So do you use modular builds more often? Do you build decarb into the modular builds? Different ways of doing that. I think everybody is clear that housing, both from a need perspective and an economic infrastructure investment possibility, is important. I think the question is how you site it, where the planning, the planning function fits into that. Lots of tensions, but lots of possibilities to help us move to the future.
And does that fit into a commercial portfolio, or does it fit into another portfolio? Is it about making money in order to pay for social infrastructure, to improve the general facilities available to the community, or is it addressing a housing need? And there's that, always the notion that land value is always what drives infrastructure. So how do you use it wisely?
And the answer's got to be all of the above.
So we've looked at physical regeneration and we've seen that there's a role to play for property in that, and we've heard from David about how the council is acquiring property and using that commercially. Is that about delivering benefits, creating inward investment, getting businesses back in to the administrative area? What's driving it? Is it the commercial income from the property, or is it a wider agenda?
Again, it is all of those, John, as part of a holistic corporate plan. And so some of it's around place setting. We purchased, one of the things I'm proudest of, in fact, is that we purchased a building which used to be a large payday loan company. It was the narrowest point between our seafront and a secondary shopping area, and every time I went past it I cringed. It was preying on people who were probably the least well off in society, and it looked a dreadful statement for the town. We purchased that, and working with the community, we used it for a community group running it with artist studios, pottery kilns, print works, and so it now looks completely different. Above it there's housing, and we rent that housing out. We have a mix in terms of our housing companies, because we've set up companies, and we'll perhaps develop a piece of land, and one side of the road we will sell, and we'll use the profit on that to subsidise the letting on the other side of the road, where we can put families in need of housing into that accommodation. But if you walk down the road, you wouldn't know which side is private and which side is public.
Okay. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so any last comments to leave with our audience, a virtual audience? What's most important about regeneration in your view? If I go round you, starting with Chris, so some of you have got a couple of minutes. The top two things about regeneration, the top three things, very quickly in our last 2 minutes.
To me, I could talk about loads, but it's to me the one that matters is placemaking, and John completed the piece for me earlier in that this is an opportunity to regenerate in our area the towns and cities of the towns of the valleys, the towns in Mid Wales, but at the same time to deal with the crisis is going to be in the major urban conurbations, which are ghost towns at the moment, and I don't see that coming back. it's going to take innovative local authority leaders and innovative local authorities to take a bit of a lead with that, because the private sector is a bit scared of what to do. It doesn't know what the future holds in terms of regenerating the office buildings that we don't need. And we also need people like the John Lewis Partnership, who are taking the lead and taking some of their big buildings and moving them into multi-purpose units, which will show us what the appetite for those is.
Thank you. David?
I would agree that it's place setting, but I'm going to put it very much into a local context, because in Eastbourne, our major industry is tourism. We don't have light industry particularly, we don't have heavy industry at all. And so we market the natural assets around Eastbourne and the environment. And so for us to regenerate, it's about getting the place right for tourists and local people together to enjoy, and making sure that that's attractive for the future.
Thank you.
For me, it's good quality, effective community engagement, enabling communities to take part in the production of their community.
Fantastic.
So for me, I'd say regeneration isn't one agency's standpoint or purview. Actually, it's everybody's, and we're all in this together. And if we don't do that, we're going to miss the opportunities of the future.
Thank you. Can I thank the guests on the panel on everybody's behalf? We're back in 15 minutes with TED Talk 2 on community enablement. See you then. Thank you.